Hello.
Hello.
This
Did
is
we start
firing it up. Yeah, we did.
Okay. Usually it tells us it's like, oh, you've started recording in that nice lady voice, but I didn't hear that today.
Oh, I'm sorry. I heard it.
Oh, good. Oh, see, look, now it just said.
That's funny. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. It's great. We're recording.
Yay.
Yay. Episode 17. Holy shit. Episode 17.
I
Did you
know.
ever think?
I kind of had hopes, but I didn't think, that we would get here. I mean, I have hopes for beyond this as well. And spoilers, we have exciting changes coming up. I guess additions, not changes to our podcast. It's very exciting.
We're growing up a little every day, and things are getting better and more exciting, and we're getting better and more exciting as people, probably.
You sounded not convinced of that, I feel like.
Yeah, we'll see. Stay tuned.
Cool. So we do have lyrics for today, which is the first time we've had them at the start of the show in a very long time. Do you want to share them?
Yeah, so today we are just using the lyrics, "Oh Bondage, up yours. Oh Bondage, no more," by X-Ray Spex, because we are talking about women in punk rock.
Woo!
Yay! We've been doing so much talking about women lately. I mean, just because, the world is generally terrible to women. And I think it's a good time for us to be recalling how crucial they are to this genre we love.
For real.
Yeah, but before we do that, land acknowledgement. We're on stolen land.
Yep, we are.
Annexed in 1893 by the Dole Provisional Government, and still blowing it today. America. Do you have any current events you want to talk about?
I do. I have a couple. So, going off the land acknowledgement thing, there is a story. It's kind of like a big deal. This dude who's a professor at a university, it's the University of Washington. They are encouraged, they have been encouraged is in quotes. They've been encouraged to include land acknowledgements on their syllabi.
Okay.
And yeah, so we're tracking, everything is good. And he didn't agree with that. So he did a land acknowledgement, but it says, hold on, Professor Stuart Regis, or Regs, Reges is his name, is a professor at the University of Washington. The University of Washington has been encouraging, in quotes, faculty to put land acknowledgements on their syllabi for a couple years. The professor, Stuart Regs, his land acknowledgement says, I acknowledge that by the labor theory of property, which is a type of theory that says that humans make, by means of working the land, producing on the land, building on the land, they can own that property. So he says, I acknowledge that by the labor theory of property, the Coast Salish people can claim historical ownership of almost none of the land currently occupied by the University of Washington. So this is kind of a big deal just because of the thing so now he's under investigation from the university because people have reported that this view is offensive. And
yeah, sure.
yeah, and of his classes of 500 students, okay, so they made a shadow class, which is a class that's taught by another person, and it's offered at the same time. They offered for anyone that feels uncomfortable with this statement to disenroll and enroll in the shadow class. So only 130 students did that. They took advantage of the shadow class, and his whole thing is that like this is infringing on my First Amendment rights, this is infringing on free thought, it's infringing on the idea of presenting different
Jesus.
worldviews and opinions in a university setting.
Hmm.
And yeah, so there I have a lot of thoughts about that, but you seem to too. Why don't you go for it?
I just always get really bothered when people invoke their rights as a baby blanket to do terrible things. You know what I mean? Like it's always really convenient to say like, well, this is freedom of speech and this is blah blah blah. And it's like, yeah, I get what you're saying, but at the same time, like they're the first people to be offended when other people practice those same freedoms. And I feel like we just keep seeing this time and time again with particular classes of people, particularly rich white men. You know what I mean? So it's like, uh, it just feels like a tale as old as time situation. You know what I mean? What are your
To-
thoughts here?
Totally. Well, I have a couple different thoughts. Universities are constantly seen as a bastion of liberal thought, and it's weaponized by the conservative party or people with conservative beliefs for why, you know, liberals just basically like are in a circle jerk or like they suck their own dicks, and
Hmm.
so why would you go to college, if they're just gonna shove this worldview down your throat? And definitely it's shown that people that get undergraduate degrees and PhDs do tend to lean more liberal in thinking, but it's mostly due to like exposure of ideas. I think it was a really bold choice. I don't agree with it. I don't agree with the labor theory of property either,
Hmm.
because if that was true, the people who have worked the land in the South were predominantly slaves, and therefore they should own more land. People who were slaves should have been given land, or they should have had the right to claim ownership of that land, especially since the labor theory of property is like a really old theory. And so people should have been able to like argue for that. And not to mention the government did say that they would give every slave like 40 acres and a mule as reparations for slavery, in like the 1800s, and they never followed through with that. So I see his point just from that like clear, like, okay, we are not opening a, I mean, like, I guess in a way we are opening this discussion, like, but I don't necessarily know if it's the right way to do it. I do also see his point that like by encouraging in quotes really means like forcing. And if you have no control over what that land acknowledgement is, or like how to state it in your own words that is true to something of your beliefs, then that it is a kind of sticky situation. Like it's becoming kind of like it's something. Land acknowledgements are clearly something I agree with. Like you and I both have a formal land acknowledgement on our website. We do a land acknowledgement at the beginning of every podcast.
We try
And
to.
we
Sometimes we
try to.
forget.
And so I guess what is the main takeaway? Um, I think I'm wondering if maybe I would agree with his position more if instead of saying like we worked and developed this land, therefore we own this land, he would have
Hmm.
went the purchasing route. Well, we bought this land. So
Yeah.
through transactional exchange, it is our land, which is still weird. I'm not saying I agree with his ideas, but I do agree with like bringing up discourse and challenging like a university as supposedly being open, but only really espousing liberal thought, I
Hmm.
guess.
Yeah, I mean, from an academic point of view, I understand why like considering every angle of this is important. I mean, no hard decisions get made without considering, or like not even decisions, but like solutions. There's like no actual resolution without considering every point of an issue. It's just it gets so complex so quickly, and especially in this climate right now, it is surrounded by so much immediate anger, you know?
Yeah.
So I get like why that is a very inflammatory statement to make right now. Not that it's not worth making for the sake of a discussion, but time and place, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, like, yeah, I don't, when I read it, I was like, oh, I literally gasped out loud. Like, I was like, I can't believe he said that. Like, I can't
Yeah.
even believe someone actually like believes that,
Hmm.
to a certain degree. But I don't know, beliefs are beliefs. They're not real per se, like.
Yeah, sure.
So he's entitled to his beliefs.
Yeah. But I mean that kind of brings you to like the flying spaghetti monster situation, right? Where it's like, yeah, you can believe anything that you want, like as batshit as it is, but like, it's like how that like theory flies in like society, is like a whole different thing. And I mean, like, we get so deep with this with like the church or like, any church really that like imposes belief systems on people. We can take this into women's rights and what like people's beliefs do like in that situation, because it ain't good.
Mhm.
I mean, it like I said, I understand the conversation from an academic standpoint. I don't understand that conversation from a humane standpoint.
Agreed.
Sure, cool.
Yeah. Um,
um, what was your other one?
the other one is like a local thing. So, you know, we like to share local news about the place that we are from because it's really important to just, provide people with information about, Hawaii, like actually living in Hawaii. So the it's now when the school year starts, effective August 1st, masks will be optional indoors at public schools, at Hawaii public schools. And I don't agree with I don't agree with it. But it's fine. It's not even something that's going to be a part of my life after this, but it is going to be a part of yours and like many other people that we know. And Hawaii is a really small population compared to like other states in the United States. And
Hmm.
just we've seen COVID cases. I mean, I don't think it's the students that are necessarily a big deal about, wearing masks optionally. I do think it's more like faculty and staff. Like, because already we have a whole bunch of reckless people,
Sure.
which no, offense to anyone that is not reckless, and does take their health seriously. And I'm sure all those people would be wearing masks. Like, the mister and I talked about it. And if he still had his job, he would still wear a mask, just for his own like personal peace of mind and like an extra barrier of protection. Um, and they're saying that this is because there's a decline in coronavirus cases and an increase in vaccine availability. But just because a vaccine is available, like we still don't have a public mandate that requires students to be vaccinated, or anybody for that matter to be vaccinated, which is where the bodily autonomy debate like really fucks me up when conservatives are, use my body, my choice or bodily autonomy when they're talking about wearing masks or getting
Hmm.
vaccines. Like those things are not mandatory. And, even indoors, if places did have a mandatory thing, you could always opt out and choose to not do the thing or go to the place or whatever. There's plenty of
Sure.
other places where they're optional. But yeah, vaccine availability does not mean vaccinated. And so I'm just a little, I don't know. What do you think about it?
I don't know. I mean, this has become such a difficult topic to discuss because the way that we're handling this on like a day-to-day basis, particularly in this state, is so mixed. Like there's a lot of people who still wear masks, there's a lot of people who don't wear masks. Our population is very small, our population is very widespread in comparison to the other islands. So like there's so many parameters to the discussion in itself on whether or not like they make sense, they don't make sense, they, you know what I mean? And like in my little brain, the way that I view it is like, you know, America's still so new to this mass concept. And what we don't realize is that like other countries, like I think my point of what I was going to say is there's like such a big conversation to be had around it right now, because there are just so many people who aren't going to shut the fuck up. You know what I mean? And like it's just going to like, it's going to be one of those things like praying in school or like keeping in one nation or God and the fucking Pledge of Allegiance, and it's always going to be about somebody's like moral agenda more than it is about like what makes sense. And so like it's a fight that's going to be fought, but like as far as I'm concerned, like the way that I view it is like, look, be polite, you know what I mean? If you feel shitty and you're going into public, wear a mask. If you don't feel shitty, I guess you are an adult who can make their own fucking decisions, but like I don't know what to tell people about it anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always of a place where like our actions affect more than just us. And I think that's why I, still feel the way I feel about it. Like, I think, yeah, you do you at this point, though, I guess.
I mean, that's just what's going to happen in the world, like from everything else we've seen, you just can't stop people from being selfish or being stupid. And like, I guess all I can say to anybody is, get vaccinated. Like, get vaccinated and, get your boosters and do your due diligence to help the situation.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. Do you have any news to share?
I did find one article that I thought was funny and distressing all at the same time, and it was that I think it was released on July 5th. The NYPD made its fitness test easier after increased retirements from the police force.
Interesting.
Yeah, I don't think that's a good idea, NYPD. Like
you're a walking city. Wait, they made it easier or harder?
They made it easier.
Okay. Just making sure that I did hear you correctly.
Well, yeah. See, like, and the problem with that is, like, it already seems like it's too easy to be a cop here, especially with like the mental exams, you know what I mean? So like, I don't think that we should like also be like, and also if you're kind of chubby, you can still be a cop too now, you know what I mean? Because it's like, oh guys, this is something that like we should maintain a strict kind of standard on, and so it is a little distressing that people that, deign to have such important jobs are now just making it easier to be out of shape and also do this job. And like, we can speak to this here too, because Hawaii has a notoriously low crime rate, when you put us in comparison with the rest of the country.
Yeah.
So like the cops that we get here, I don't know what they're like when they join the force, but like give it a few years and like I do not see how they could possibly chase anyone down. Like I've seen very few fit cops, let's just put it that way. And I would even say I've seen more obese cops than fit cops, So like I just feel like it's just such a silly thing. Like they're trying to argue about like the importance of like cops and like give the police departments more money and like do all these things and like, but then like, oh yeah, let's also just make their fucking fitness test easier. Like, Jesus Christ. And like, that was just a silly one that I thought was stupid and funny and sad and all the things at once. And then another thing, good news. Let's put the good news in here.
Yeah.
So good news is that This is an article that was released on the Good News Hub on the environmental section, and it was written by Victoria Pressler. And it states that the U.S. House of Representatives has passed a wildlife conservation bill that will see $1.39 billion allocated to conserving endangered species. The Recovering America's Wildlife Act was passed in a 231 to 190 vote on Tuesday, and this amazing feat will see money directed to protecting 12,000 species of plants and animals. The money will be dispersed in grants to nonprofits in order to create and maintain habitats for endangered animals, and it will also provide funding for providing education to underserved communities. So, like, that's cool, you know?
Yeah, I was wondering who was going to manage that. So it sounds like it's going to nonprofits instead of to states.
Yeah, which, like, yeah, you know, as somebody who works for nonprofits, but there are a lot of nonprofits out there doing a lot of cool work. So I guess if that money can get into their hands, that's a good thing.
And let's focus on the good, because it's good news and not critical.
Yeah, exactly.
Critical analysis of news.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, let's just look at that. At least some money went towards the environmental protection of plant species and flora and fauna. So
yeah,
cool.
That is very cool.
Yeah, I guess we didn't even check in with each other this week.
How are you doing? No, yeah. Well, we did a kind of a big check-in before we got started recording, and you know, that went places like it does.
Yeah, those are all the things I'm not going to tell our listeners about.
Yeah.
My life.
Other than that, like, my life is going like nothing too crazy, just trying to get some shit in order, like, for our immigration interviews coming up. And then, you know, that's nerve-wracking because it's just, you know, they can deny your visa, so nothing is guaranteed. So I don't know, I'll be waiting until we get those back, which can be up to 4 months. And we are going to Chicago for that, and we leave on Sunday. But before that, we're doing a trip to Oahu. It's literally like a 24-hour trip. Although Hawaiian just changed our flight. They do this thing, which is really maddening, where they'll just change your flight, like, and they'll send you like a notification that your flight has been changed, but it doesn't even have like what your previous flight was and then what it was changed to. It only shows you like what it was changed to. And so as someone with kind of like a bad memory, like, I'm like, I know I booked this for earlier. And then once you view the notification, like, because I get an iPhone alert, like, it just like disappears. So there's like, I'm like, I know I booked this flight earlier, but anyway, our returning flight is for like later. I know it's such like a Manini problem. It's a tiny problem in the grand scheme of things, but like, I feel like it's not really cool.
I had to leave my house like 6:30 this morning because if I don't have internet, I can't do my job. And so I like left my house like 6:30 this morning and like drove up to a friend's house up in Kohala Ranch and was like, I have to call Spectrum. I have to figure out what's going on. And they're like, oh yeah, we'll have a technician come out on Saturday to look at it. And I was like, yay. But I guess enough of my neighbors got mad and called because when I just drove out of my driveway, there was a Spectrum truck fixing shit on our street. So
that's amazing. Go the privilege of having rich neighbors.
Yeah, something. I don't even know if they're rich neighbors or just really bitchy neighbors.
Oh,
but somebody was really unhappy they couldn't have their internet and better at bitching than me. We're in the middle of how you're doing this week. You got big things going on. You got big shipping things going on. You got big
yeah, I got big stuff. So when I was actually just waiting for you, I finished all of my organizing our paperwork with all the tabs nicely aligned for each thing they're looking for our applications. And
That's it's very Al thing to do.
Yeah, I'm super like, did I do this right? Is it okay? am I missing anything? Because like they can still reject our application and then we're going nowhere, and like that's not cool.
Yeah, but I mean, you have to be like aware of the fact that a lot of people are not trying nearly as hard as you're trying to get into that country, and they get it, every day. So like I
Thanks.
wouldn't ever think twice about being like, I'm gonna put tabs on all my documents. So
It just helps me. Yeah.
you're ahead of the curve is what I'm saying.
Oh, thank you. So is there anything else you want to talk about what's going on, or was the internet kind of it for, does that sum up your week?
That does not sum up my week. We had a really dope interview that is coming up for a future episode that I'm really excited about. I also got to see a couple of my old friends, and like I've also like come to a place in my little brain where I've decided that I'm not mentally healthy with like my position in life right now, and that it needs to change, which is always like scary, but like also exciting, because I just feel like I've been in a place where I have been I guess like life shouldn't feel like a grind. And I know that it's like really common in American culture for people to tell you that like that just means you're working hard or something, but like no, that means that you're fucking killing yourself for something you don't enjoy that much. And like it's different if you have kids or like people that you have to support and like this whole agenda that this grind is supporting, but like for me that's not the case. And the fact that I have a grind with like such a low overhead is ridiculous. So yeah, just trying to like make some positive choices for my mental health here.
I'm so proud of you. Yeah, it's very important.
Also we hit over 400 followers this week, which is like fucking incredible.
Yeah, thank you. We are so appreciative, and like we're so excited to share these changes with all of you and to just like welcome you all into our little Instagram family and podcast family thing, and just thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, episodes like moving forward are only going to get more interesting. We're gonna hopefully the sound quality is going to get a lot better. There's going to be some changes coming. That's exciting. So I like to think that sums up more of my week than this shitty internet.
Yeah, sometimes things happen and then it's just very like, oh, well, yeah, this is a perfect whatever thing to happen.
A clusterfuck. Yeah.
So I'm really excited about our topic today, which is Women in Punk Rock Part 1. And I have been thinking a lot lately about how I really screwed the pooch on that Rebel Girl title episode. Like, I really feel like I should have named it, since no one gave us a lyric, I should have named it That Girl Thinks She's the Queen of the Neighborhood. You know what she is, because that just is such a great lyric. And I just kind of wish I would have used it instead. And Bikini Kill, really important to women in punk rock.
Yeah, totally. Definitely one of the formative bands that we are going to talk about today. And, it's our podcast. I guess if we really wanted to go back and change the name of that episode, we could. What are you guys going to do about it?
Yeah, I've actually been thinking about doing that. And then I'm like, oh, I don't know. Yeah.
If you feel like you want to, then you should. I think you should.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the permission. I need permission.
It's not permission so much as it's just support.
Oh, thank you. I need support in the form of permission and approval.
Validation.
Yeah, that's it.
Cool. Well, yeah, let's move into that topic then. That's the worst segue I've ever done. It's very on the nose.
I know. I was like, I set it up. It was perfect.
Yeah. A long day.
Yeah, I can imagine being up since 6 is kind of rough. You're going. Yeah, so punk rock, as we've talked about many times, has started in the 70s. Well, I mean, like proto punk rock in the 60s, and then like bands started coming together in the mid 60s. First album release, you know, sometimes is the Rolling Stones. And we went with the Stooges for our album review, which is their 1969 album released in 1969. But at that time, women were doing things too.
Yeah, women women have been doing stuff every day for a long time.
No.
But I think, you know, the topic of women in punk rock, I thought a lot about how to address this subject, because obviously we don't want this to be any one kind of woman in punk rock. There's a lot of really essential key players, biological women and not, that make up, you know, this really important legacy of women in punk rock.
Agreed.
So, and then like also just like women's overall influence in punk rock, and how how the music was shaped based solely on the existence of women in punk rock, I think is a really important topic to cover, you know, because I think it would have been a lot more, or it could have been, it would have been a very different thing if it had just been a boys' game from the start, you know?
Yeah, I actually have a question for you. Did you like women fronted all female punk rock bands when you were growing up?
I did. You know, when I was coming up, it was the late 90s, early 2000s. So the bands that were available to me on like a mainstream basis were mostly like bands on like Black Cat Records, I think is Tim Armstrong's record label, from Rancid. And that was like the Distillers, and that was F minus. And I really like heavy punk rock. Even to this day, I still really like heavy punk rock. So like long before like the days where I knew about like crust punk and all of that stuff, that's what I liked. But I admittedly took a really, really long time to be able to listen to like Bikini Kill, you know? And that is always more of a stylistic thing for me, though. Voices are particularly hard for me to stand, male or female. So if I don't like your voice, I just probably don't like your band that much. But you know, that was just the like my introduction to punk rock, and so I was very choosy about what bands I liked, I guess, is to answer your question. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense about voices and stuff. And when you said that, it reminded me of something like the short answer is no, I didn't. So I grew up like my punk influence was from like the early to late 90s. And so some of the female fronted bands were more considered alternative instead of punk, even though they were punk. I had a thought like, and it was, why is she so angry? You know, and so I think that thought is an indoctrination in the patriarchy, you know, like,
Sure.
yeah, why is this person like yelling or screaming or like singing so aggressively or something? And so I bought my friend's daughter, she was exploring like vinyl and rock and like punk and stuff, and I felt very compelled to buy her the Bad Cop, the Ride album. It's it was my favorite album of 2020. Her daughter just was like, why are these people so angry? And I was like, oh no, it's too late. Like, it's too late. Because like when I listened to that album, I'm like, oh, if I had this growing up, like I don't know how changed and empowered I would have been. Like, this is like the kind of punk rock I feel like that women needed, you know. But like even with Tilt, which was the Big Fat Records female fronted new school punk rock band, like it was like, oh, why does her voice sound like that? You know, like oh, why is she so angry? And I realize that that is more a thought of being indoctrinated in the patriarchy for me than like a critique on the band. And so I made time in like 2010, 2011 to like revisit all of that 90s Riot Girl scene and just
Mhm.
try to give it a chance, like the chance that I should have given it if I wasn't so indoctrinated in the patriarchy as a child.
Sure. I
Yeah.
also think that like as you get a little older, like it becomes less solely dependent on like the music and the sound of the music, and you start to learn about like who these people are
Hmm.
in these band, and like who these women are, and like why they're important to like this culture that you love, and so that makes it more palatable as well. There's still I still have a really hard time with voices, and
Hmm.
I probably wouldn't pop on a Bikini Kill album if I was like driving in my car by myself, but like, do I respect the fuck out of what they do? Like, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think, there's just like because like I definitely remember when I was younger referring to this kind of music as like bitch rock, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that was like really common, like for me and all of my friends to like refer to that, you know, particular genre. And it's not that like we didn't have friends that liked that music, but you know, there it was a way fucking gnarlier time in terms of like, what was acceptable and what kind of intolerance was just flying. I mean, that was the 90s and the early 2000s, so
Yeah, it was great for a lot of things. Like it was great for the advancement of a lot of things, but if you look at what those things are, they're still mostly like male dominated. The agenda is still pretty sexist, pretty racist, pretty misogynistic.
yeah, totally. And so I think we have this really interesting and really poor misconception of what women in punk rock are, because I think it is so easy to, on like the surface, kind of imagine a woman punk rocker to be like a feminazi, or like a very like masculine, or like very, kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Just like very like we don't we don't give them the credibility of being women, I feel like, right? There's like a
Mm,
weird negative kind of connotation that stands around. And I guess like the Riot Girl scene maybe had a hand in like creating that imagery,
hmm.
because there was definitely a propensity for like very tough behavior in that scene.
Hmm.
But like I think that we need to really explore like what came before Riot Girl and before the like modern day mental image of like what a female punk rocker is. So let's talk about
Yeah.
the 70s.
Woo, the 70s.
Patti Smith, let's talk about Patti Smith and how fucking important Patti Smith is, not only to like rock and roll in general, but like punk rock. Like, was she the godmother of punk rock? I think so. She's fucking incredible.
Yeah. Many people attribute her in that role, and I think that's awesome. And what's so great about it is that she did it all with grace and femininity that isn't usually attributed to punk rock, like we were just talking about.
Yeah, and like her brand of like androgynous is what so many people accredit her as being, like androgynous, but like I would totally disagree with that. I think that she dressed with a lot of pragmatism. You know what I mean? Like,
Hmm.
a lot of people like to say that she had like an androgynous style of dress, but mostly she was just wearing like pants and like collared shirts and stuff. Which, if you saw a woman wearing that today, you wouldn't refer to that as androgynous.
Mm-mm.
And I mean, she was just a true artist. So I would say, and like the world would say, I think that Patti Smith is the not the most influential woman in punk rock, but definitely like
force.
A force, yeah, for sure. That's the right word. Thank you. You know, and then at that same time, though, you have like Joan Jett and the Runaways coming up. And like the Runaways had a more short-lived career than Joan Jett, but I definitely would argue that like the Runaways is like what built Riot Grrrl in the 90s, you know, that sound especially.
Yeah, I would agree with that with the sound. And I love that they pulled inspiration from, David Bowie for like lyrics and theatrics. And I mean, like part of the reason why they didn't have a long-lived career is because they were fucking exploited. They were like teenagers. Like it wasn't okay.
Yeah, their manager was a real fucking creep too.
Yeah.
I remember, I don't know if you saw the movie that they made. It wasn't very good.
I
But
did see it. Yeah.
yeah, they did put a lot of focus, particularly on the fact that their manager was a fucking creep. And they did really point out that like the lyrics to Cherry Bomb weren't necessarily something that they were comfortable with which is like their biggest hit, right?
Mhm.
So I think it is, good to remember, like, or that's like a really good example of just how young they were.
Yeah. Yep. They were wee babes being exploited.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, through that, they found, all kinds of things about themselves out. They explored their sexuality on the road in like really uninhibited ways and like had experiences that not a lot of teenage girls were having.
Yeah. Which did a lot to like shape their music and their like how they perform together and I don't know, their dynamic.
Yeah, and one thing that I really love about the bands in the 70s is something that we don't see or like we don't talk about a lot moving forward into like music, where especially like the Runaways, they all played instruments, right?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like as you kind of move forward into like the world of punk rock, women get this like, or like just rock and roll in general, women always get this like frontman position, where it's like, oh, they're singers, like they're not really like musicians though, and I think the 70s is like all of these bands in the 70s are such a good example of like how wrong that is.
Yeah. Or like if you have a woman, it's more likely to make you marketable. Like female drummers are a super hot commodity, like they're so rare. Drummers in general are rare.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely female drummers, which is a really, really funny thing because like what is it about drummers? Like I guess I like to think that like what makes drummers so rare is the fact that nobody's parents want to buy them
a drum set.
Drum sets. Yeah. Like who has the capacity to like handle that, right? Like,
yeah. There's also anyway, it doesn't matter. We're just like musing about like anecdotes about drummers. It doesn't matter. But yeah, other bands in the 70s, one of your favorite, well, I consider them one of your favorite bands. Crass came out then too, and I have to admit I never heard of Crass until I met you.
Yeah, the thing that I think that's so phenomenal about Crass and Patti Smith and just even like what punk was going to be moving forward is there were so many poets in punk rock, you know what I mean? And just like especially like females in punk rock, like genuine poets. And that is the thing that I think is most striking about Crass. And like we have to remember that Crass was coming up in like the same time the Sex Pistols were. So like when you were getting like God Save the Queen, you were also getting like Crass's era of like Banned from the Roxy and like some of their more elementary stuff. But like as you follow Crass's career from like the late 70s into like the early 80s, their lyrical prowess just got so insane, and it was mostly based on like the female members of the band. Funny enough, those same members would later go on to be members of the band Chumbawamba.
Oh, really? Oh,
Yeah.
no. Oh. Well, everybody's tastes change and evolve over time, so.
Yeah, I mean, it Chumbawamba was also like they were a very different band in the 80s. There's a really, really good documentary called The Day the Country Died. And sorry, her name is Penny Rinbaud. I didn't want to say her name until I could remember what her last name was, who is the member of Crass that would eventually go on to be the lady singing Pissing the Night Away is what they're saying in that stupid song. Is that right?
Yeah, and it's The Day the what died?
The Day the Country Died.
Okay.
Which is a phenomenal book written about the UK like early 19 it's basically like 1980 to 84, the anarcho years of like the UK punk scene.
Oh, nice.
And so many incredible bands came out of this era, like Crass and like Flecks of Pink Indians, and like I think that Zounds was another really phenomenal band, and it's like this whole very unexplored like side of punk rock for the mainstream, like especially American mainstream like ideologies of punk rock.
That's really cool.
Yeah, and like I was saying, there were so many like poets coming out, because it was really just about the lyrics. And if you ever like I was saying, like Chumbawamba was even a very different band in the 80s. In this DVD that I had of The Day the Country Died, this documentary, they show them playing a song called I think it's Replication. And if you heard this song, you would never think they were the Chumbawamba that would later do I Get Knocked Down. Big jump.
There's
yes.
Oh, go ahead. Oh, no, I was just gonna, if we were done, I was thinking that we didn't mention that the first transgender woman also came out in punk rock in the 70s.
Totally, and she's a fucking badass.
Yeah, Jayne County.
Who is now in her 70s, I think, and is still performing.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so cool. And I think we saw a lot of like playing with the bounds of sexuality and like gender rules in like the late 60s, but like I believe Jayne County was the first person to come out in the punk rock scene, as far as transgenders went, which is like really, really cool. And really amazing that she is still performing today.
Yeah, agreed. Patti Smith was also instrumental in forming the band The Slits, which is another like teenage female punk rock band.
Yeah, German based, I think, The Slits, right?
I think so. I don't know too much about them. I've heard a couple of their songs, but I just thought that was really cool. I didn't know that. It's so weird. It's not weird, but it's interesting to see how, influential, like, and intertwined the scene is. Like, they really do, like, bring each other up and, like, help each other out, like, make great music and be seen on a world stage.
Yeah, totally. I think one thing that you can definitely draw from the 70s with like the punk rock rise, especially for like the feminine side of punk rock in the 70s, was that it was very artsy, right? Everybody was very avant-garde.
Yeah.
Siouxsie and the Banshees would come out of this, I think, late 70s, early 80s, and all of it was very avant-garde. It was very artsy, which is interesting, where like it took a turn in the 80s to be more, I think punk rock starts getting a little tougher in the 80s in terms of like well, in general, because, you know, America is doing American hardcore, and
Yeah.
there's just there's a lot more brute happening, especially with like what we talked about in prior episode with like the rise of bands like Motorhead and like thrash being born, and, you know, things like that. So I don't love the 80s era of punk rock female bands.
Yeah, I can't really tell you a whole lot about what's going on in there, except for like I like, so this band that I like that I didn't know was formed in the 80s called the X-Ray Spex, which they gave us our lyric today. That song actually came out in 2005, and I love that song, but I never would have guessed that they formed in the 80s. So we have that extreme put up against Blondie, which is like really poppy. And it's just kind of like, I feel like even though it's hard, like, you know, it did that bifurcation real early. Is it poppy or is it hard? I don't know. I'm not really a fan of 80s punk or 80s female fronted punk bands.
I agree with that. And I think it's because they're like the whole trend that happened in the 70s, you know, and like 77 punk rock with like fucking the Sex Pistols and all of that stuff. Like it opened that door for mainstream culture into punk rock. And so I feel like things like Blondie weren't really punk rock, but like the same thing we were kind of talking about in the pop punk episode, where it's like, okay, so like the thing that's making this punk rock is like the clothing and the attitude, right? Because Blondie doesn't fucking sound like punk rock to me.
Yeah, I don't really know if they follow any of the traditional like punk rock conventions. But I do know that Debbie Harry's style is like really like sought after as an inspiration, even in homages to like punk today. Like you know, Harley Quinn's Suicide Girl, sorry. Suicide Squad outfit was totally inspired by Debbie Harry, an outfit that she actually wore. And I was just wondering about like how influential, like, because, you know, we've omitted Vivienne Westwood from this conversation because we're just talking about punk rock bands. But if we are going to talk about like the fashion of punk rock in the 80s, then like, I mean, she had a role. I was going to ask you what you feel like her role was. Is she overcredited, undercredited, credited just enough?
I think like music wise, I think she's overcredited for her role in punk rock, and like I could probably get in a lot of trouble for saying that. I'm sure there's a lot of people who feel really differently about that. But fashion wise, that's actually that's interesting, you know, because like then if we're going to talk about that, we have to talk about like everyone else who was also doing insane like bondage fashion and like, you know, being really over the top in the 80s, because like Vice Squad, right? Like Vice Squad, like their lead singer's name is Becky Bondage. Like she was, you know, by role a dominatrix. Like a lot of the Vice Squad songs are about being a dominatrix. And so like she was also introducing a lot of this same kind of fashion. I think it was more geared towards like bondage wear than just what Debbie Harry was doing. I think she had a lot more kind of like Bowie-esque fashion going. But I like I said, I think she's much more credible for fashion than she is for music.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There's some other bands that like formed in the late 80s that didn't really hit their stride until the 90s that I think are worth mentioning, and those are the Lunachicks and Hole. Like I'm not really a big Hole fan, but I feel like you can't deny that they did make an impact, because their sound was so different than other bands at the time. And then just like that, I don't even know, tragic relationship with Kurt Cobain and stuff. So I don't know. I think they're worth mentioning. I really like the Lunachicks. They came out in the late 80s. The late 80s for me is like a sweet spot of bands getting formed. I don't know what it was about like the times and just the way that they like put shit together and like broke shit and took it apart and like made it their own. But like bands that were formed in like 87 to 89, some of those are like my favorite bands.
Mhm.
And the Lunachicks, they're just they they wrote a memoir about like their time together, and I think that was actually collaborative. Like everything they did was pretty collaborative. They've been like in films, and their first album came out in 1990, but I don't know, just they're really inspirational, I think, as a band. I don't even know. I think it's because they're so like feminine, but their music is like hardcore. I just kind of like that juxtaposition.
Yeah, I think if we're going to talk about juxtaposition too, like we should mention the Plasmatics.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because like Plasmatics was, well, they were formed in the late 70s, but they kind of dipped out for a couple years and then like made another resurgence in 87, which I think is more the years people remember them for. And Wendy O was definitely this really, really interesting juxtaposition of like femininity, and I mean to like the extent of like, you know, being topless on stage, and you know, wearing thongs and wearing just really obscure like bondage wear beyond like dominatrix clothes, but like just a lot of a lot of skin, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But like also was known for being so fucking gnarly, like Gigi Allen kind of gnarly on stage, you know.
Mm-hmm.
There's a really famous photograph of her actually, and I think it was from 87, where you know about the Sledgehammer Incident.
Mm-mm. No, I do not.
Yeah, so she had a concert, I think it was at a festival. No, it was a concert in Milwaukee, and she had a sledgehammer on stage that like she was just being really over like sexualizing with for Milwaukee. She was like pretending to deep throat it. She was like, you
Oh,
know, doing
Wrecking
all,
Ball style.
yeah, totally. That's actually where I think that drew influence from. And so then she like then proceeded to pretend to masturbate with it.
Mm.
And she basically like was met off stage by a bunch of cops who beat the shit out of her and
That's
arrested her. Yeah,
terrible.
you can find her mugshot from that night online, and she's got like a big fat swollen eye and stuff. But yeah, she was like, you know, super notorious for that kind of behavior. And I think that is like a place where we start to see like femininity and this like very punk rock, very like wild attitude, you know, starting to mix, which is like what we would see in the 90s with Riot Girl as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. So, I mean, so what in the 80s there was still a lot of like over the top theatrics, it seems like, like whereas like I can't really like that kind of thing, like exaggerated makeup and like the music as performance still, I think that like music as performance art instead of
Yeah,
like the
sure.
performance of music, right? Where I think it really did become more about like the music and the lyrics and like in the 90s like
Yeah, I
bands.
would agree with that for sure.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah. And so I noticed so L7 is on the list, and they're a band that I firmly like equate with like alternative. I don't, but that's because Alternative is just I feel like it's just a genre catch-all name for bands that were like punk but palatable enough for the mainstream. You know, they could make them indie. There was appeal there. You could reach a broad audience with alternative because it's less damning. Like the 80s too weren't very kind to punk rockers, as we talked about in like our movies episode, you know, just the stereotyping of punk rock. And so like I think alternative made punk rock more palatable, but I firmly situate L7 and Cannonball, I think was like one of their big songs in the alternative genre. What do you think about alternative, just as an aside?
I mean, I honestly wouldn't even know what, like you said, it's such a catch-all that I wouldn't even know what to place in that box. Like, in my brain, L7 is like the quintessential Riot Girl band. You know, it's like Bikini Kill and L7 and like 7-Year Bitch, you know?
Cool. Yeah, I definitely L7, I mean, 7-Year Bitch and Bikini Kill for sure.
Yeah. So like, and I guess if I think about like 90s alternative, I think about things like Alice in Chains.
Mm.
But that's only maybe because I am younger, but like also B don't really care for a lot of like the mainstream like alternative things that were happening in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, it's all just this one big genre that I don't listen to. You know. But I think the interesting thing is like what women's roles were doing between like the 80s and the 90s, you know, because like you did have these very like performance art-esque kind of acts like Plasmatics and like, you know, this very like avant-garde art piece, heavy makeup, very like dramatic fashion. And then the 90s, you kind of saw that tone down and become very subdued. And I mean, not super subdued. Like I've seen some pictures of like L7 looking pretty intense, I guess. But like it definitely took a turn to being
Serious.
Serious, yeah. It felt way less artsy and way more angry and way more agenda driven than like 80s female fronted punk rock, you know?
Agreed. And that's actually one of the driving things like of Riot Girl is that it is like very issues driven music. Bratmobile is the other one I really associate with Riot Girl. And like they all talk about, you know, abuse and rape and like what is the role of women, like what is the patriarchy, and then all the like, and even though that's present in other genres of punk in the 90s, like it really was defining of Riot Girl.
Totally. I would say that like Crass was doing that for sure in the late 70s with like albums like Penis Envy and songs like Beta Motel are very much focused on like, you know, the oppression of women, but I don't think that it was really brought back to the mainstream or like even brought to the mainstream at all, I should say, until Riot Girl happened.
Agreed.
And I don't know if it's just because like where we were in terms of like punk rock and like how long it had been around, like if it was just in its like post-adolescent idealistic phase, you know.
I like that.
Yeah. But like
oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say it seems like it kind of became like an educated person's game at this time, you know.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing that throughout punk rock in other genres in the 90s as well. Like it's just super prevalent in Riot Girl. And I think that's one of the things that turned off a lot of people to Riot Girl. And like you were saying, created, maybe not created, but definitely added to the feminazi image, which we've already talked about how that's not like a cool thing, you know, in previous episodes and stuff. And I just learned too about like a subset of it called queercore, which is something I didn't know existed, but those bands, like queercore as a genre, was part of a movement that like talked about disapproval of LGBT folks. And so I think it's cool that as a subset, like already, I mean, not even already, all throughout history, right? Feminism is always tied to like sexual rights, sexual freedom, and inclusion. And just that there's an offset of it of Riot Girl, I think is really cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always kind of been these movements like, you know, quaking in the underground for people trying to capture like a platform for their voice, and punk rock has always been a really great tool for that. I don't know like where culture was, like, you know, Western culture I should say, was to like accept LBGTQ like culture, like ideas, you know what I mean? Like we were ready to take on Riot Girl ideas as a mainstream concept in the early 90s.
Yeah.
I would argue that right now is probably more that phase where like the world is ready to hear that and embrace it, you know what I mean? The way that we embrace Riot Girl music.
For sure, I definitely agree with that.
I also think that like Riot Girl, although that image that negative image that it carries with it is not necessarily accurate, there was a lot of behavior that happened within that scene that I wouldn't necessarily approve of in terms of like this very like man-hating kind of ideology.
Yeah.
Where like also we can talk about the fucking L7 tampon incident, which is fucking gross, bro. You know, like,
I don't know about any of these things that you know about. What is this tampon incident?
Oh, dude, that's a gnarly one. So L7, they are playing, I believe, Reading Fest, and that took place in 1992. And so they're playing this fucking music festival and they're having technical issues while they're setting up. And it's 1992 and kids are being kids and they're mad that they have to wait for L7 to set up. And somewhere in like this waiting time, the crowd decides that it's a good idea to start throwing handfuls of mud at the stage. And
that was a big thing in the 90s.
Yeah. I mean, really, we remember like Woodstock and like, you know, I think 94 broke out into like a giant mud fight.
Yeah, as an aside, I went to a Strung Out show. It was an outdoor show at an amphitheater and people just started picking up like handfuls of dirt and grass and shit, and it's like, what is this? This is weird. I don't understand. Anyway, sorry.
No, it's okay. Yeah, well, you know, as kids do, they grab things and they throw them. You do it from when you're a little kid to apparently when you're a full grown-ass college student. And so Danita Sparks, the lead singer, she goes behind one of the big speakers off to the side of the stage and she removes her tampon, and then she comes back out and she throws her tampon into the crowd and very famously yells, "Eat my tampon, eat my used tampon, fuckers." Which is hideous, dude. Like that would bum out my whole fucking day. And like, I am a girl, I have periods, okay? Like, I'm bummed out by my own period because it's, you know, it's not the most pleasant thing in the world, sanitary issues wise. You know, I would be really bummed to be in a crowd where somebody else's tampon was floating around. But like, I think the thing that was so staggering about it too was their bassist later came out with a statement that said that that's just something they did all the time. Like, they would like take their used tampons and like throw them at cars and stuff, and like, you can feel whatever way you want about that. Like, if you're like, fuck yeah, ladies, like, that's up to you, dude. But I'm just gonna go ahead and say like, that's pretty gross. I don't support that as good human behavior.
Yeah, that's
so
a
that
little
kind
rough.
of yeah. You know, and so like that's what I mean when I say there's like a couple things about like I think where like we get into like the riot girl scene and like women in punk rock where I get a little bit like yeah. You know, like I like the artsy stuff, I think. You know. But yeah, you know, and then I think like we talked about in prior, you know, episodes, we were talking about just like the evolution of like punk rock and stuff like that. You start moving into the 2000s and punk rock becomes this really weird, like very whitewashed, I don't mean whitewashed as in like racially, I just mean like this very like thinned out version of itself, you know. And music gets really accessible, and yeah, you end up with like a bunch of mainstream women in punk rock that I think are arguably less influential. Like I think a lot of people would be like, oh, the Distillers and like Brody Armstrong or Brody Doll, or I don't know what name she goes by now. But yeah, I mean, I think it starts to become a matter of opinion.
I mean, yeah, as far as in the mainstream, but there's still a whole bunch of other stuff happening. Like White Lung, you know, formed in 2006. I think I know that Shauna Potter of War on Women. I mean, really, the 2010s like started to see a flourishing of punk rock again, like especially American hardcore and new school, and like those are my two favorite genres of punk. So those are the two that I definitely know
Sure.
were doing things. And like, I mean, we see the I mean, like, again, I think that's in the 2010s. I'm trying to think if who else got their start in 2000 in the 2000s, and that is a hard one for me. I don't really know except for White Lung.
I feel like there was kind of this like weird mixture of I know like the horror pops were like a really big thing in like the 2000s, you know, and like so that like rockabilly side of like
Yeah.
punk rock and like but
Money was really going to pop punk. So it was like people
yeah.
just kept on doing what they were doing if they were already in bands. And if, you know, the new bands that were coming up were all in that bifurcation of pop punk that we had talked about in the pop punk episode.
Yeah, and then I mean like it starts to suck because you start to get like these really big mainstream figures, especially like women wise, who like have nothing to do with punk rock that are just being called like punk rock
Yeah.
because the world doesn't know any better anymore.
Well, and I think again, it's more focused on the punk aesthetic, you know, than actual punk rock. Like, I think that's definitely where Avril Lavigne is situated for me. And so I think it does a disservice, right, to uncouple like the way that we talked about, you know, punk fashion instead of and like not verses, but like punk fashion as separate than punk music. And it seems like punk fashion is still considered punk music, which I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that.
Yeah, like if we're gonna talk about punk in like the modern day or like what this like resurgence of like you know air quotes punk rock right now, like it's 100% fashion based, and like I understand that like there's women making strides like in the mainstream right now to sing like female positive music or like you know what I mean to like spread that message, but that doesn't necessarily make it punk rock. I did like what we were talking about though, and like in terms of like what we are seeing a lot more of today that's very cool is like the transgender like availability, like the accessibility for like transgender bands right now, right? Like transgender women who are getting a platform to really like be who they are, like Laura Grace Kelly, is that
Oh, I don't
Against
know.
Me?
Oh, I didn't know that Against Me had a trans member. That's cool. I like
Yeah.
Against Me.
Yeah, so that was actually
Oh, I guess they came out of there and Tiger Army.
Tiger
Anyway,
Army.
yeah, the 2000s. But Against
Oh,
Me came out in the 2000s.
that's true. Against Me did come out in the 2000s, and he like arguably was like the best like modern band that came out of the 2000s in my book.
That's cool.
Yeah, I mean, just I don't love all of their music, but like for where they struck a chord with me is like they released their acoustic EP really early on. That's just totally the kind of stuff that I'm into. But the alternative press wrote a really good article where they listed like 10 trans punk rock women musicians.
Oh,
And
interesting.
yeah, and these are all modern people that I had never really heard of, you know. I know that fuck, I feel like I'm fucking that name up. I'm pretty sure it's Laura Jane Grace, excuse me, is lead singer of Against Me and started this band before she made her transition. Which is why you were probably unaware that they were fronted by a trans woman.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, but they did write an entire album focusing on her journey. I believe it was called The Transgender Blues.
Cool. That's awesome.
Yeah. And yeah, she's living her best life in the body she's comfortable in now. That kicks ass.
That's really great.
Yeah, but like, you know, we're gonna post this on our show notes, and there's like a lot of other artists that like I had never heard of before today that are really out there making music.
One band I want to talk about is Gloss, and so it's an acronym and it stands for Girls Living Outside Society's Shit, and it's a transgender band. They advocate for transgender rights. They are D-beat and hardcore punk, so you might like them because you like D-beat. And I really love them. And when I heard them, I didn't realize they had already ended their time together. So they were really short lived. I think they only produced like one album. They were together from 2014 to 2016. Again, just talking about how amazing like the 2010s were for like punk and American hardcore. They're fronted by Sadie Switchblade Smith, and like one of their songs came up for me too when we were kicking around lyrics for this episode, and I really do want to highlight them in a you know title one time for sure, but I highly recommend giving them a listen.
Cool. Yeah, that's really incredible. There's like a lot of really interesting styles of music coming out of this list. I did go through this list on Alternative Press. They have links to all of their music videos, you know, so that you can like hear what these artists sound like. And there is this artist named Emma Girl spelled GRRL, and she fronts a band aptly named She, Hers, and Hers. She, Her, Hers.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. And the whole like description they give on this list sounds like it makes them sound like they're like an emo kind of like band or like a pop punk band. They sound a lot like AJJ or like, you know, something from that whole side of like Pat the Bunny kind of music. It's like very acoustic, just like very raw, kind of like folky, punky, poppy music, you know?
Yeah, I'm okay with some of that. Like I feel like after a while it can get really repetitive, especially if you just keep singing about the same thing. I know that. Yeah, I know. Yeah. You know, though, Bridge City Sinners, or not Bridge City Sinners, Bridge City Sessions is also out of Portland, Oregon, and they record they do like live performance recordings of all
Mhm.
local bands. And so like I found a couple of bands through them. There's a band called Mangy that is female fronted, and they're really cool, and they're kind of like they're a little outside the box in what they're singing. Like they're bringing avant-garde back, I think, into their
Mhm.
performances, and it's just really interesting to watch like this new modern take on avant-garde.
Mhm. Sure, I could see that. I would also say that I had never heard this artist before today either, but Inako. I know that I've heard this name before, but I've never actually heard this artist before. And also, I think playing really heavily with like the avant-garde fashion and, just kind of like aesthetic while having like a political message.
Ooh, yeah, that's
Yeah.
always good.
And I mean, it's poppy and it's kind of like post-punky, but I think like this is like a whole new movement in punk rock that we're kind of seeing for today, especially in a time where like music is so eclectic and so accessible. So it is really exciting to like see this scene evolving.
For sure. I'm checking out this list too, and like I have heard of See You Space Cowboy, and I think that's really cool that they're on this list. I didn't know that as a band there was a trans person in the band. This is a cool list.
Yeah, it is a cool list. Yeah, like I said, a lot of these artists I had never heard of before today, and so it is like it's exciting to know that like there's a platform for this. There's like a whole scene existing around this right now, where all of the artists are so different, but like all of them are just kind of united in like this, like these are trans women like having voices, making art, you know what I mean, and like having like this very great platform for it. And like cool, good job alternative press, you know what I mean, for like compiling this and like putting this out there as well.
Yeah, for sure. Any other bands that we forgot or that you want to highlight from any era?
I you know what, I did have one in mind that I was like, oh, you know what, yeah, we should talk about like real quick. In the 90s there was a lot of really good like female involvement in like the 90s crust scene, like Nausea, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think like that is worth mentioning, that we have to talk about like the whole side of crust that was happening, like Antischism, Nausea, like bands like that. Or there's so many good bands that came out like the 90s crust scene that were female fronted, that were so much less intense than the riot grrrl scene in terms of like shoving like gender in the equation.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like the agenda of the riot grrrl scene was to put women at the forefront, whereas like what was happening with like the crust scene and like women in that same era, where it was like we're just also musicians, without
Yeah.
having to be like I'm a woman first and then a musician, or something like.
Yeah.
And so I think those are really really excellent bands to check out. And also I think that is going to be my band shout out for this week too.
Ooh, nice. Don't forget to put it in the or do you, yeah, I guess what is the song that we should listen to?
If you're going to listen to anything, I would listen to Antischism Self-Titled, that was released in 1992. Or I'm sorry, I believe it was the year before, 19. Oh, hold on. I'm getting confused. I'm seeing 3 different dates for the release on this album, which is confusing. Let's say 1998. Antischism's 1998 self-titled album. Oh, that's what's happening here. I'm gonna have to edit this. They have like 3 different releases because I guess the album got released 3 different times, like on different labels, and like one time like on like a compilation and stuff.
Yeah, that happens.
Right.
Uh,
But let's say the 1998 version, because you can find that on Spotify, I guess, the Antischism self-titled album. And when I was like,
sorry.
It's okay. What happened?
I was clicking on a song because I wanted to know the year of it, and it jumped to the YouTube video.
Oh. Anyway, yeah, so Antischism, their self-titled album, I guess you can find it on Spotify. They're saying it was released in 1998. I don't believe that's true. I'm pretty sure a lot of these was released earlier. But if I'm going to recommend a song, Salvation or Annihilation is an excellent song. The whole fucking album is great, though. And that's my band shout out for this week.
Awesome. We talked a lot about what was going on in the UK, but there was a band called Shonen Knife that came out in the 90s as well, and they're from Japan. They're like more avant-garde punk fashion, but I do feel like it's important to mention them because they were really influential in that time period. It was one of the first female bands that I got told to look at. And even though the person like said it as a joke, like I still respected like what they were doing for the scene, and it opened up like room for Sushi Mamire, who is like one of my favorite Japanese bands. And that was not going to be my shout out, but maybe it will now. No, I'm going to stick with my original shout out, which is the song that accidentally played. It's Therapy by the band Not on Tour, and it's off their album Growing Pains, and it was released in 2019. Again, the 2010s, just amazing for, punk rock and what's going on in punk rock. Yeah,
and this is, we at the top of the episode said that this is part 1. We are going to revisit this subject, and ideally we're going to do that in conversation with some women who were raised in punk rock scenes, who played in punk rock bands, and get like a firsthand opinion of like what inspired them, like what era was the most meaningful for them. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah, it should be very exciting.
We're going to open this conversation up. Do you have any organizations that you want to shout out? Anything like that going on?
I kind of don't. I'm really sorry about that.
No,
what
it's
about
okay.
You?
I don't either, because my day was a clusterfuck of the internet doesn't work and I don't know how to live. It's really shitty that like my job has made me so dependent on whether or not there's a Wi-Fi connection.
Yeah, that's the downside of being a digital nomad.
Yeah, for sure. So like, I just spent the day in fucking chaos because of that.
Yeah. Well, it's okay. We're human. We can skip an episode.
Yeah, totally. Also, you know what? Real quick, I do want to remind everybody that Chris from Therapy in San Diego at Therapy SD on Instagram is still in their battle with cancer, and there is still an active GoFundMe to help raise funds to get through that. And it would be really, really excellent. They just entered their second round of chemo. And if you can give, and if you're interested, or, if you listen to Therapy and you decide you like their music and you want to support a great band, like that's the best way to do that. So you can find that link on our page, on our link tree. And yeah, if you can, just, keep the donations going for Chris.
Awesome. Well, I know it's later than either of us were planning, but as always, it was amazing talking with you and like laying this down. If you, dear listener, want to connect with us, let's have the conversations. You can shoot us an email at outonAnislandpodcast@gmail.com and follow us on Instagram.
Yay! Thanks, everybody.